Why do terrible things happen? You know, plagues, famines, wars that just don't make any sense. For thousands of years, we've been trying to find reasons for all the chaos in our world. Well, if you were living in ancient Mesopotamia, one of the answers was a god. But this wasn't a god who was just, or wise, or even all that reasonable. Nope, he was a god with a very, very bad temper. And his justification for destroying everything? It was as chilling as it was simple.
When I get angry, I break things. Just let that sink in for a second. Imagine hearing that from a being who holds the power of life and death in their hands. What kind of god offers such a terrifyingly simple reason for total devastation? A god who is quite literally destruction itself.
So, the god behind that terrifying line? That's Nergal, also known as Erra. For the people of the ancient Near East, he was the divine explanation for death that came out of nowhere. When cities fell and plagues raged for no apparent reason, yep, that was Nergal. So what was on his divine resume? Well, it's a pretty scary list. War, death, plague. He was the embodiment of destructive force. He wasn't a god who punished sin. His job was to be the destructive force. He'd just rampage at will, destroying stuff without any thought or remorse, acting on pure impulse. Think of his actions like a wildfire or an earthquake, just chaotic, impersonal, and absolutely devastating.
And don't think for a second that this was some minor fringe deity. This timeline shows that Nergal was a major player for nearly 3,000 years. He starts out as a local god, Mesopotamia, but his identity eventually merges with another destructive god, Erra, and his influence just explodes across Mesopotamia. His staying power really proves how essential he was to their whole worldview.
To really get a handle on Nergal's character, we have to talk about his most famous story, the Wrath of Erra. This myth perfectly captures this terrifying idea of a god, driven not by some grand cosmic plan, but by simple, agitated boredom.
Okay, so the epic kicks off with Erra just feeling blah. He's restless, he's bored, his own weapons are literally complaining about gathering dust. So what does he decide to do? He decides to shake things up by attacking Babylon, the jewel of Mesopotamia, and the city under the protection of the top god, Marduk.
But how do you attack a city when its most powerful protector is at home? Well, you use a clever trick. Erra goes to visit Marduk and pretends to be absolutely shocked at how shabby the great god looks. He convinces the embarrassed Marduk that he desperately needs a new wardrobe, and even offers to watch over Babylon while he's away. Marduk, totally grateful, takes him up on the offer.
The second Marduk is out the door, all hell breaks loose. Erra unleashes his full, pent-up fury. People are slaughtered in the streets, buildings collapse, the entire social order just crumbles. And here's the key, the destruction is completely random. The good die right alongside the bad, because this isn't about punishment, it's about a god just indulging his destructive side.
So this brings up the big, obvious question, right? Why on earth would you worship a god whose defining feature is a terrifyingly bad temper? How does a faith that's all about cosmic order make room for a god of pure chaos? Well, the answer is way more complicated than you might think.
You see, Nergal wasn't just a mindless wrecking ball, he was also a king. And to understand that part of him, we've got to look at another key myth, one that shows how even the other gods tried to put a lid on Nergal's chaotic energy.
So the story goes that the gods, who were probably getting pretty tired of Nergal's rampages, arranged for him to be sent down to the Underworld, the land of the dead. This whole realm was ruled by the super formidable Queen Ereshkigal, and the hope was basically that she could keep him in check. But this is Nergal we're talking about. He doesn't play by anyone's rules. He storms into the throne room, overpowers the queen, drags her to the floor, and is about to kill her. In a desperate plea for her life, Ereshkigal offers to marry him and share her power. Nergal's like, okay, deal, and seizes kingship of the Underworld, not through any kind of diplomacy, but through sheer, brutal force.
Now, this myth wasn't just some crazy story. It had a real-world application. The story says that Nergal has to spend half the year with his queen in the underworld, but for the other 6 months, he's free to wander the earth. This provided a perfect cosmic reason for why wars in the ancient world were often seasonal, fought only during certain times of the year when Nergal was out.
Okay, so he's a destroyer and he's a king. But this is where Nergal's story takes its most fascinating, most contradictory turn. The very same god who embodied plague and destruction was also seen as a powerful protector.
This is the core paradox of Nergal. On one hand, he's the god of plague, but on the other, he's being called on in healing spells and exorcisms. He brought death, but he was the one you called to fight off evil spirits. He was blamed for the massive Hittite plague that killed a king, and yet priests would call on him for protection. How does that work?
And this wasn't just some fringe idea. I mean, look at this. This is a quote from an actual Babylonian healing spell. It places Nergal in a position of honor, at the priest's right hand, right alongside the gods of the sun and the moon. He's a key member of the divine protective detail.
So, what's the logic? It's actually pretty brilliant. You fight fire with fire. Who better to protect you from sickness and demons than the god who literally commands those exact forces? It's a profound psychological move. By giving chaos a name and a face, they could actually bargain with it, appeal to it, and feel some sense of control over the uncontrollable. You call on the ultimate destroyer to handle the lesser threats.
And this whole idea, this archetype of a god who is both a destroyer and a protector, it wasn't just a Mesopotamian thing. This concept of a god of war and plague was a shared feature across a ton of ancient cultures in the Near East.
Nergal had clear equivalents all over the place. In the Levant, there was Reshef, the god of pestilence. The Hittites knew him as Uplu, a plague god. And get this, on the island of Cyprus, Greeks and Phoenicians actually identified Nergal's counterpart with their own god Apollo, another deity who was famous for bringing plague with his arrows, but also for healing. It's the same paradox.
Nergal's legacy was incredibly long and varied. He was tied to the color red and forces of chaos. Some mystical texts even called him the Underworld Sun, the sun that travels through the land of the dead at night. He even gets a shout-out by name in the Bible, and it's thought that his whole character, this powerful, dark ruler of the underworld, it may have helped shape later concepts of figures like Satan. So Nergal wasn't just a simple villain in the Mesopotamian story. He was a complex and, honestly, a necessary character. He was their answer to one of humanity's oldest and toughest questions. Why is there so much random suffering in the world? Well, the answer was a god who sometimes just got angry and broke things. The Mesopotamians created Nergal to give a face to chaos, a reason for the unreasonable. And it kind of makes you wonder, in a world that still has plenty of senseless destruction, what's our explanation today?